All right, so get ready, because today we're going deep on something pretty radical.
Yeah, definitely radical.
Voluntaryism and anarcho-capitalism.
Two big ideas.
Yeah. Ever wondered what it'd be like to live in a world without, well, government?
No government at all.
Like, what if, like, all of our interactions were based on, like, consent?
Voluntary, yeah.
Not somebody forcing you to do something.
Right, no coercion. Just free interaction.
Yeah, so we're going to, like, really unpack that.
Big question is,
how could a society actually function if there's no one in charge?
No central authority, no one calling the shots.
Right, exactly. So to really dig into this,
yeah, we've got
a stack of sources here.
A lot to cover.
Yeah, and the first one, anti-subjectivism.
This one's interesting.
This one's like, it's kind of a heady one, but it lays a really interesting philosophical foundation.
Yeah.
For this whole idea.
This idea of minimizing arbitrary choices when we think about ethics.
Right, minimizing arbitrary choices. So, like, what does that even mean?
Well, think about it this way. Most ethical systems, like right and wrong, they're based on assumptions or values that someone came up with. They're subjective, right?
So it's like, it's good because I say it's good.
Kind of, yeah. But what if we could find a way to base our ethics on something more solid, more objective, something that's true regardless of what any one person thinks? That's what this theory is all about.
Okay. So instead of saying this is good because I believe it's good, we're trying to find something more universal, something that applies to everybody.
Exactly. And the source argues that recognizing that there's a reality outside of our own heads, like things exist whether we want them to or not, that's actually a step toward building a less arbitrary system. Because if everything is just subjective, then any ethical system kind of falls apart, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Like nothing matters if it's just like whatever you think.
Exactly. So that's a really deep point this source makes.
Okay, so that's anti-subjectivism.
Yeah, and from there,
laying the groundwork. And then we move on to something that's
even more radical.
Yeah, the most dangerous superstition.
This one really gets to the heart of anarcho-capitalist thought.
So what is that?
Questioning the very idea of authority. We're so used to just deferring to authority figures, whether it's parents when we're kids, teachers, bosses, police officers, government officials.
It's everywhere.
It's everywhere. And we're taught to obey them without question. But what if that's actually a huge problem?
That's what this book argues.
Exactly. Larkin Rose, the author, he asks this really provocative question. What if this blind faith in authority is actually the root of so many problems in the world? What if we're giving up our own freedom and responsibility by just blindly obeying anyone who claims to have authority over us?
And he uses this example.
Not a carjacking example.
Yeah, like if some random person comes up to you and says, give me your car, you'd be like, no, that's stealing.
Theft.
Right, theft. But what if the government says, we're going to take a chunk of your income through taxes?
And we call it law.
Is it really that different? Just because they have this authority?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah, it really makes you think about where does that authority even come from?
Exactly, because if it's not based on our consent, then what is it based on?
Right, because if it's just based on force, then is it any different?
Is it any more legitimate
than that carjacker?
Exactly. And that's a really uncomfortable thought for a lot of people.
It is, yeah. And Rose goes even further in this book. He actually says, the belief in government is basically a religion.
It's a bold statement.
Yeah, it is. But when you start to think about it, it's like...
it kind of makes sense in a way.
Yeah, we're taught from childhood to obey the law, even if it goes against our own morals.
Right, like the law is the ultimate authority, even over our own conscience.
Like it's a commandment from on high.
Exactly.
And I don't know about you, but I'm way more likely to obey a traffic law than I am to take my friend's advice about safe driving.
Even if your friend knows more about driving than whoever wrote that law.
Exactly. And that's kind of scary when you think about it.
It is, because it shows how deeply ingrained this obedience to authority is.
So all of this blind obedience, like where does that lead us?
Oh, that's where things get really disturbing. The source brings up this chilling example, the Milgram experiment.
Oh, yeah. The one where they told people to give electric shocks.
To another person.
Right, to another person. And they thought they were causing real pain.
Yeah, and the scary part is how easily they obeyed, just because some guy in a lab coat told them to.
It makes you wonder, like, are the people who commit, like, atrocities, are they just inherently bad people?
Right.
Or are they just products of a system that prioritizes obedience over everything else?
And the source takes it even further. It suggests that tyranny doesn't just thrive because of the people who enforce it, but because of everyone else who sees injustice happening and does nothing.
So it's not enough to just not participate in evil. We actually have to stand up and resist it. Hold those in power accountable, even when it's uncomfortable.
Exactly, because silence is often interpreted as consent.
Wow. This is getting really intense. But I think it's really important to wrestle with these questions
Well, absolutely.
if we're going to even begin to understand these ideas of voluntarism and anarcho-capitalism.
Because it's not just about rejecting government, it's about understanding the dangers of blind obedience and taking responsibility for our own actions.
It's about freedom, but it's also about responsibility.
Exactly. True freedom comes with responsibility. It's not about chaos or the absence of rules. It's about building a society based on consent, cooperation, and individual accountability.
Okay, I'm starting to see the deeper implications here. But I think a lot of people hear no government, and they immediately picture like a lawless wasteland. You know, like
Mad Max.
yeah, Mad Max.
Everyone fending for themselves.
Yeah, total chaos.
Right, but that's a really common misconception. Anarcho-capitalism isn't about eliminating services. It's about providing them differently. Take the food supply chain, for example. No central food czar is dictating how food is produced and distributed.
Right.
But millions of people get fed every day. It's a complex system that works through voluntary exchange, market signals, and individual incentives.
So you're saying the kind of decentralized, self-organizing system could work for other things too?
Exactly. Anarcho-capitalists believe those same principles can create order in areas we typically associate with government, like security or justice.
So instead of a centralized police force, what would law enforcement look like in a stateless society? Like, how would we even begin to imagine that?
Well, think about it like choosing your phone provider or internet service. You'd have competing private protection agencies offering various security packages. You pick the one that best suits your needs and your budget. It's about choice and competition.
Interesting. But wouldn't that just lead to chaos, like everyone hiring their own private armies?
Not necessarily. Remember, these agencies would be operating in a market. That means they'd be subject to competition and customer feedback. Those that resort to violence or violate agreements, they would damage their reputation and lose customers.
So there's a built-in incentive for them to actually be ethical and effective.
Exactly. They'd be motivated to resolve conflicts peacefully and build trust with the communities they serve. After all, a protection agency thrives when its clients feel safe, not when it's constantly engaging in violent turf wars.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about courts and the justice system? How would disputes be settled without a government-run judiciary?
Again, think about choice. Individuals and communities could agree in advance on preferred arbitration providers, much like we choose healthcare providers today.
So instead of a one-size-fits-all court system,
Right.
we'd have diverse options tailored to specific needs and values.
Precisely. And just like any business, if they don't satisfy their customers, people will go elsewhere. Competition would incentivize them to be fair, efficient, and impartial.
This is starting to paint a picture of a more personalized and responsive system. But it still feels like a massive leap to imagine a society without any central authority at all. What about national defense? Wouldn't we be vulnerable without a standing army?
That's another area where anarcho-capitalism challenges conventional thinking. Remember, the core principle is self-ownership and non-aggression. This doesn't mean passivity in the face of threats, but rather finding different ways to ensure security.
So instead of a monolithic government army, what would defense look like?
Think of it as a decentralized network of individuals and community defense organizations. Think neighborhood watch programs, private security firms specializing in defense, and even individual citizens exercising their right to bear arms.
But wouldn't that be less effective than a professional unified military force?
Not necessarily. A decentralized system could be more flexible and adaptable, able to respond quickly and creatively to specific threats. Plus, in a free market for defense, providers would have to prove their effectiveness to attract clients.
So instead of blindly trusting the government to protect us, we'd have a more active role in choosing and evaluating our security providers.
Exactly. Competition would drive innovation and efficiency, just like in any other market. Instead of a bloated military-industrial complex, we'd have a more dynamic and responsive system tailored to actual needs and threats.
Okay, I'm starting to see how a lot of what we traditionally think of as government functions could potentially be handled by voluntary market-based solutions. But what about things like public goods, clean air, scientific research? Don't those require government funding?
That's a classic challenge, but anarcho-capitalists argue that even these areas can be addressed through creative solutions and voluntary cooperation. Take clean air, for example.
Right. How would that work in a stateless society?
Individuals and communities would still have a strong incentive to protect their environment. They could do so through property rights, easements, and private environmental protection organizations.
So instead of relying on government regulations, which, let's face it, often end up benefiting big polluters more than anyone else, we'd have a system where those directly affected by pollution actually have more power to address it.
Precisely. Those harmed by pollution could seek restitution through arbitration or take other collective action to protect their property and well-being. And for scientific research, think about private foundations, universities, and even crowdfunding.
Like how people already contribute to projects they care about on platforms like Kickstarter.
Exactly. In a free market, scientific advancement wouldn't be limited to government grants and bureaucratic processes. Individuals and organizations could directly fund research they believe is important.
This is making me realize how much of our current system relies on the assumption that government is the only way to solve problems. But what if we started from a different premise? What if we assumed that people, when given freedom and responsibility, could find solutions through voluntary cooperation and market mechanisms?
That's the fundamental shift in thinking that these sources are pushing us towards. It's not about utopian fantasies, but recognizing the potential for human ingenuity and compassion when we move beyond traditional authority structures.
This deep dive is definitely making me question a lot of assumptions I didn't even know I had. But there still is one big question looming in my mind: poverty and social safety nets. How would we take care of the most vulnerable members of society without government welfare programs? I mean, that's a big one, right?
Absolutely. It's a crucial question, and one that anarcho-capitalists often address through the concepts of voluntary charity and mutual aid.
Okay, so how would that work in practice?
Think about all the private charities, religious organizations, and community groups that already exist today. In a stateless society, these would likely flourish as individuals have more direct control over their resources and can choose to support causes they believe in.
So instead of a one-size-fits-all welfare system that often traps people in dependency, we'd have a more diverse and personalized approach to helping those in need.
Precisely. And because these charitable organizations would be competing for donations and demonstrating their effectiveness, they'd have a strong incentive to be efficient, transparent, and genuinely help people become self-sufficient.
This is really making me think about how much of our current system is based on this idea that government is the only answer. But what if we explored different approaches like voluntary charity and mutual aid as legitimate alternatives? Like, what if we really gave those ideas a chance to flourish? I mean, that's a whole other conversation, isn't it?
It is, and that's the beauty of exploring these ideas. They challenge us to think outside the box, to imagine different possibilities, and to consider whether there might be better ways to organize society that prioritize individual freedom, responsibility, and voluntary cooperation.
This deep dive is definitely giving me a lot to chew on.
Yeah.
But even if all these potential solutions sound good in theory, how do we actually get from where we are now to a truly stateless society? It seems like such a massive leap, you know? Like, how do we even begin to bridge that gap?
Well, that's where the rubber meets the road. And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so stay tuned, folks. We're just getting started.
Yeah, it's a big leap, for sure.
It is.
But the source emphasizes starting small, focusing on building alternatives, proving that these voluntary solutions can work in the real world.
Okay, so like, what does that even look like?
It's about creating these pockets of freedom, experimenting with different models of cooperation, showing people there are other ways to address social needs without relying on government, without that coercive power.
Okay, so less about like overthrowing the system overnight.
Right.
And more about building something new step by step.
Exactly. It's about fostering a culture of self-reliance, mutual aid, ethical entrepreneurship. And we're already seeing examples of this happening all around us.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Think about things like community currencies,
Okay.
cooperative businesses,
Right.
alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. People are out there organizing, solving problems without waiting for government to come in and do it for them.
So we're already kind of doing it, in a way.
In a way, yeah. We
Okay.
just need to do more of it, scale it up, show people that it's a viable alternative.
That's actually really encouraging. It's
Yeah.
easy to get bogged down in, the big picture
Right.
and feel overwhelmed.
Right.
But focusing on what we can actually do, building something better from the ground up, that's empowering.
Exactly. It's about taking ownership, taking responsibility, and building a future we want to see.
Yeah, okay. And I guess history shows us that change can happen in unexpected ways.
Oh, absolutely.
Like these radical ideas that kind of bubble up,
Right.
and then they become mainstream as people experience the benefits and realize, hey, there's a better way to do things.
Exactly. Think about how many ideas that were once considered fringe are now just common sense. The world is constantly changing, evolving, and what seems impossible today could be the norm tomorrow.
This deep dive has definitely been a mind opener for me. I feel like I'm looking at the world in a whole new way. It's challenging, provocative, raises a ton of questions,
Yeah.
but it's also incredibly liberating to realize we don't have to just be passive subjects of a system that might not even have our best interests at heart.
Yeah.
We can actually create something different, something better, something truly free.
And that's the beauty of it all, isn't it? It's about reclaiming our agency, embracing our freedom, and building a world that reflects our values.
It is, yeah. This has been a wild ride. So much to think about. For all of you fellow deep divers out there, I'll leave you with one final thought. If government, as we know it, just vanished tomorrow, what kind of world would you create?
Yeah.
Would you just rebuild the same power structures?
Right.
Or would you embrace the challenge of building something truly free and just? I mean, the choice ultimately is yours.
Yeah. It really is. Like, we've uncovered this whole new way of thinking about things, freedom, responsibility, what it means to build a just society. It's a lot to process.
It is, yeah. And it's understandable to feel a bit overwhelmed, even a little scared, when you start to question these fundamental assumptions about how the world works.
Because it's like we're so conditioned to see government as the solution to everything. So to even imagine a world without it, it feels, I don't know, almost dangerous.
Right, like we're letting go of that safety net. But what if, instead of fearing the absence of government, we saw it as an opportunity, a chance to reclaim our own agency, our own power to shape our lives and communities? Okay, I can see that. It's like a reframing, a different perspective. But practically speaking, where do we even begin? If we were to actually try to create this stateless society, it just seems so daunting.
Well, the source emphasizes this idea of starting small, focusing on building alternatives, proving that these voluntary solutions can actually work in the real world.
Okay, so what would that look like? What are some concrete examples?
It's about creating these pockets of freedom, these little experiments where people come together and find ways to meet their needs without relying on the traditional power structures.
So less about overthrowing the entire system overnight,
Right.
and more about building a different path forward, like brick by brick.
Exactly. It's about fostering a culture of self-reliance, mutual aid, ethical entrepreneurship. And we can see examples of this happening already all around us.
Oh yeah, like what?
Think about things like community currencies, where people create their own systems of exchange outside of the traditional banking system. Cooperative businesses, where workers own and manage the enterprise together. Alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, where people find ways to resolve conflicts peacefully without going through the traditional court system. These are all examples of people taking initiative, taking responsibility, and building a better world from the ground up.
Wow, yeah, when you put it that way, it's actually kind of inspiring. It's easy to get bogged down in the big picture and feel overwhelmed. But focusing on what we can actually control, on what we can create right here, right now, that's empowering.
It is. It's about reclaiming our power, our agency, and realizing that we don't have to wait for permission or for someone else to fix things. We can start building the world we want to see today.
This whole deep dive has been a real mind bender, honestly.
Yeah.
It's challenged me to think differently about, well, pretty much everything. It's definitely raised more questions than answers, but it's also lit a fire under me, It showed me that there are other possibilities, other ways of being, other ways of organizing society.
And that's the power of exploring these ideas. They push us to question our assumptions, to expand our horizons, and to imagine a world where freedom, responsibility, and cooperation are the guiding principles.
And ultimately, it's about recognizing that we have a choice. We don't have to settle for the status quo. We can create something different, something better, something that truly reflects our values.
Absolutely. The power to choose, the responsibility to act, and the possibility of building a society that truly honors the dignity and freedom of every individual.
This has been one heck of a ride. So much to think about, so much to explore. For all of you fellow deep divers out there, I'll leave you with this. What kind of world will you create? The choice is yours.